country. There's massive. I want to move it on, if I may, Guy, because we want to talk about the cultural issues which David led us on to.
I just wanted to make a point about the technology.
Yeah, if you would. So, yeah, Maya, we haven't heard from you yet. Let's talk about those cultural challenges, the globalisation of people, if you like. People going round the world throughout history has made the world go round, hasn't it? But there are people in this country, and David was speaking about it, who have seen rapid change in front of their eyes, and they've also been sneered at by the liberal intelligentsia as racists.
So I think that's a bit of a crude analysis of what's actually happened. I think the whole immigration debate needs to be put in the broader context in which migrants have been consistently scapegoated. So we've seen migrants blamed for low pay, we've seen them blamed for crumbling public services, and what's actually going on, all the evidence shows from the LSE to the OECD that migrants aren't a significant factor in low pay, and that it's underinvestment in our public services that's leading to them to collapse. So I think that there are a number of things going on with people's cultural anxiety. I think that is a real thing. I'm not denying that it is. And we need to look at the other factors alongside immigration. But just to talk about immigration first, I think that the whole immigration debate, it needs to be recognised. Zubaida Haq from the Runnymede Trust has talked about this, that anti-immigration sentiment is not always correlating with the numbers of immigrants in the country. So if you go back to 1978, you will see that when there was net migration was 0, you will see that 70% of people in Britain said that they felt that their culture was being swamped by migrants. So what that tells us is that we need to be recognising that anti-immigration sentiment is very deeply entrenched in this country, and we need to be addressing.
Is it? Because we've had a lot of attitudinal change on many social issues since 1978, which goes against that particular time. So, can you compare like with like?
Well, I think that what we can look at is the fact that there has consistently been a hostile environment to migrants. If you look at government policy from the 1960s, there was a concerted effort to keep migrants of colour out of this country. So what I'm saying is not that we should be ignoring people's concerns, what are often deemed legitimate concerns by politicians, but we should be recognising that instead of just calling people racist, we should be addressing why there is prejudice. That's not to say that everyone who is anti-immigration is racist, but it is to recognise that there is an element of racism and an element of prejudice within that anti-migrant feeling, and I think we need to be addressing that, trying to break down difference as opposed to reinforcing those differences, because people all over the world have far more in common than a lot of this discourse would have us believe.
You've written about the challenges, the cultural challenges. What would you say to Maya, what you've heard from Maya?
I entirely disagree. I think you would be hard-pushed to find a single country in the world that has been as tolerant and as welcoming of migration as this one. In fact, I cannot think of one anywhere in the world. I've travelled widely, not just on our continent, but across the world, and I can assure you that if the numbers that came into this country over the post-war period up to now had gone into any other country in the world, we would be seeing a very different response. And I think this is a knee-jerk assault on the British people, which is continuing and should stop. We were talking earlier about some of the economic implications. The economic implications of globalisation include the possibility that people born in this country, at the same time as somebody in this country has a child, they are competing with dozens of other children around the world to get to the lifestyle benefits that people across the world would dream of and which people in this country think is their birthright. And that's changing. And that's going to change across all sorts of parts of the developed world. And one of the things that makes that change far, far more painful is the idea that it will happen simultaneously with an assault on their identity. Because people can potentially take the stagnation of wages, they can potentially take the living standards questions, but if at the same time you say, oh, and by the way, maybe we don't always say you're racist, but we sort of imply it, then I think you're going to build up a lot of problems for the future. And by the way, very quickly on your 1970s point, one of the things about migration is it takes a long time for that effect to happen. If you look at the opinion polls on migration in this country that followed the influx after the Blair government, it took time for people's attitudes to, as it were, harden on migration, precisely because the impact of that migration takes the time to happen. So as well as it were, misrepresenting the facts, I think you just have to be extremely careful not to say you know, this country, which is, as I say, the most tolerant country in the world, is in fact the most bigoted, because if you travel anywhere around the world, you will see a very different picture.
I would just like, I think Douglas makes a very important point there. This point about tolerance is part, as far as I'm concerned, part of the problem. For decades, people have been told to put up with people, and there's never been a concerted explanation to demystify difference. So people have been told, you know, put up with that person living down the street. They're different from you, they've come from a different country, maybe they cook a different cuisine. Put up with them.
What if they have?
Don't say
Can I
anything.
ask you something? Because this comes to the heart of what so many people are debating at the moment, and it's actually at the heart of Douglas's book, and we'll get his response to it in a moment. What if they have a fundamentally different set of values, social values? Because we've come through, well, it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation this year. We've had that, we've had the Enlightenment, we've had the Age of Reason. It's been a long road to where we are today for our, broadly speaking, you know, liberal values. What if people are inimical to those?
So firstly, we need to look at the fact that the history of Britain is one of my people coming in and out of the country. So this idea that values exist in this kind of hermetically sealed unit of the nation state quite clearly isn't true. If you look at David Olusoga's Black Britain, you'll see that over 2,000 years, people have been coming in and out of this country, contributing ideas and to social change. And what I would like to be answered on this question of social values, what are the social values? What are the social values that we feel are at risk by migration? Let's pinpoint them particularly because this is consistently talked about from the right, and it's never quite clear.
I can do. Firstly, on your point about the constant movement, actually, the movement into these islands in particular has been really minimal over I mean, what was the biggest event over the last millennia? The Norman Conquest. About a 5% population shift as a cause of the Norman Conquest. So this idea that, as it were, the movement has been perennial. Also, the movement that you're talking about most of the time is movement from France with the Huguenots, for instance, Protestant French people, or movement from Ireland into what we now call mainland Britain. That is not the same as somebody from Eritrea or Ghana or Myanmar moving in to live in Salford. It's a totally different movement, and you should admit that.
What's so different about people from Eritrea, Myanmar and Ghana?
My God,
Please
you
tell me
can't have gone
specifically.
anywhere.
Specifically.
You can't have gone anywhere. If you honestly have to answer that question. It is a simple
Well,
statement
answer it for our benefit.
It is a simple statement of the obvious that countries and cultures have differences.
What
it doesn't
cultures?
mean
Specifically, what are the cultural specificities?
Okay, I'll give you the history lesson. This
they don't need to
country
be patronised.
has, throughout most of its history, been for instance, a Christian country. It has been, I'm not a practicing Christian myself, but it has been historically a Christian country. It's been particularly a Protestant Christian country.
I mean,
with
there's
views,
Christians in
if I may
every
just finish, you see, you ask me to define something, and then I try, and then you talk. You have institutions. You have institutions that, for instance, epitomise the country. In this country, the institutions that epitomised our country were an established monarchy, for instance, the establishment of Parliament, the establishment of the judiciary and of the law courts, the establishment of the great educational institutions. A whole set, I could go on and on. Now, see, one of the problems is, whenever people say, well, what is this thing that you call Britain? We have an identity. It's forever being put on a psychiatrist's couch now and being deconstructed. But we have an identity just as other people have an identity. We don't have to war or hate each other, but we should recognise it exists.
OK, Myra, we'll come back to you. Just hold fire just a second. Let's all... OK, Guy.
I just want to put in a stylised fact. We actually in this country do not have a very high percentage of migrants. It's actually slightly less than the European average. I happen to be a migrant who lives in Europe and works in Europe. And I don't share your values, I don't share your identity. I share many of the identities and values of people with whom I live in Europe. And I think this is complete nonsense, if I may say so, because I think we're no more tolerant or less tolerant. Some people are tolerant in this country. We've absorbed many groups over the years, but so have many other countries, and it's great. It's great.
Well, no, it isn't great. We now have a populist reaction against it.
It isn't great, you said.
No, it isn't. But you're also wrong that we're close to the top in terms of numbers over the last 20 years or so.
No,
we
we're
are.
not. 13%.
No, it's more than that now.
It's not.
But anyway, we have had a very big change. The immigrant and minority population in Britain was about 4 million in the mid-90s. It is now closer to 11 million. I mean, and in many places this has led to a great change. But at the same time, and people in all places at all times are hostile to large-scale immigration. We just have to be realistic. You know, people prefer similarity and familiarity and stability in their lives. I mean, that's just a fact of life. But at the same time, that the numbers have been going up and the anxiety and the wariness about it has been going up, racial hostility, racist attitudes have been going down. I've just written a book about the value divides in British society. You look at the British social attitude surveys on all the great things.
That's what I was hinting at earlier. Our social attitudes have changed enormously in the last 40 years.
A massive liberalisation, a great liberalisation has gone on over sexuality, over gender, and over race too. And I think that there's something else we have to remember. I mean, we have an absolutely in-your-face globalisation. Now, it's one thing if your factory closes and moves to China or Myanmar, is one thing. But when that happens, and then a whole population, a whole different population from you is imported in your country to compete with you in your own place, that is a very, very big difference.
Let me pick you up on something, if I may. Let me pick you up on something, if I may. I just want to wind it back to something you said there about the fact that we've had a huge liberalisation process in this country. Would you say we had in Europe, we have the gold standard of human rights in the world? Would you say we are the leaders?
Well, we started first. I mean, our anti-discrimination rules, which we drew partly from America in the mid-60s, they set the tone for much of what was happening.
So, but I mean, so Maya, how do we lead the rest of the world and bring them to our gold standard, our more, provocative here, our more advanced human rights?
Well, quite frankly, I don't agree with this idea that we're bringing the rest of the world where we're leading. If you look at the history of leading? No, if you look at the history of the British Empire, what you'll see is actually a very bloody history. And now, I mean, I think that it's...
In terms of LGBT, in terms of women...
I think that racial attitudes, actually, if you look at the British Social Attitudes Survey, there is increasing people who say that they are intolerant and do not like people of different races. So that is actually increasing. So I think there's a problem...
There has been an upward blip in a long downward trend. An upward blip because the change has been so radical and rapid.
Well, we can't ignore that. And to come back to Douglas's point originally, which I think we need to probe more, is this idea that...
Probe away.
Is that this idea that British society, he listed the monarchy, he listed Parliament, that is somehow under threat from people from Eritrea, Ghana and Myanmar. That's not clear to me how that's the case. You've listed all these institutions, but you haven't really explained exactly what it is that is under threat from these people.
A quick answer from Douglas, because he has to answer that, because he's had a direct... He's had a direct challenge there, and then Sam, I'm going to come to, and Linda, I'm going to go Linda first, then Sam, but Douglas, answer that direct challenge from Maya.
You can do it on all sorts of things. You can do it on historical attitudes, or you can do it on, for instance, current social attitudes, which is, I'll throw out as one example. And take an example that Nikki just cited of tolerance. I think we agree in Britain that we're a tolerant country, we're meant to be a tolerant country, we try to be a tolerant country, and so on. There's been polling in recent years that actually shows that the more immigration you have, the less tolerance you have on certain issues, not because we, the British people, have become intolerant, but because people come with views of their own. Let me give you a very quick example. A poll carried out 2 years ago by YouGov asked people their opinions on homosexuality, morally acceptable or morally not acceptable. Across the country as a whole, about 14% of the British people said homosexuality not morally acceptable. In London, it was double that. Why would that be? Is it because London, the capital city, is just a particular home of homophobia? Or might it be, as I would suggest it is, because people come into the country with attitudes of their own? And you may deprecate that, and I deprecate that, but we should at least acknowledge it, and you're trying to cover it over.
No, I think that actually, this poll, what's actually, there's another poll that shows actually, and asks about attitudes towards homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and you actually find, apart from Scotland, in one of the questions, London has better attitudes towards homosexuality than the rest of the country, than other regions in the country.
They could be evangelical Christian, they could be certain Muslim communities. You know that attitudes are harder on that. That is
but my point is that Douglas is citing this poll, but there's counter evidence to that. And I just want to make a broader point that yes, there are some attitudes that I don't agree with, such as homophobia. I think that we should be challenging those, because if you go back to the late 1980s, even Margaret Thatcher was saying that our traditional children were being taught traditional moral values, were also being taught that they had an inalienable right to be gay. And that led to the Section 28. So the point is, social attitudes do change, and you should be encouraging other people to change.
Wait a minute, OK. People will make up